When the weather got rough, the crew of the Carl D. Bradley had grown accustomed to an unsettling sound rattling deep within their ship. As she hogged and sagged, lifting and falling with the waves, her steel hull would groan mightily, interrupted by an occasional sharp clanging sound. One by one, her twisting and bending was causing her rivets to fail. Her crew joked that the 30-year-old ship was held together with nothing but rust as they scooped the shattered rivets into a bucket and carried on with their work. The ominous warnings warranted little alarm, and the Bradley, once the Queen of the Lakes, sailed on, growing more vulnerable storm after storm, wave after wave. The Great Lakes are a world of their own, and nowhere is this more evident than in the evocative unofficial title given to the largest ship sailing those great freshwater inland seas: Queen of the Lakes. The Carl D. Bradley held this distinction for 22 years. Founded in 1912, the Bradley Transportation Company, a subsidiary of the massive United States Steel Corporation, was created to manage a fleet of limestone carriers on the lakes. Limestone is an important ingredient in steelmaking, used to remove impurities during the blast process. The Michigan Limestone and Chemical Company, another subsidiary of U.S. Steel, operated the largest limestone quarry in the world near Rogers City, Michigan. And the Bradley Transportation Company would play a vital role in carrying these materials to steel plants in Ohio. This lucrative business gave rise to a large fleet of self-unloading lake freighters. In 1923, the keel was laid down on hull number 797 at the American Shipbuilding Company in Lorain, Ohio. Plans called for a massive flagship that would represent the power and prestige of the Bradley Transportation Company. At a length of 639 feet or 195 meters, and a beam of 65 feet or 20 meters, she would easily surpass the previous Queen of the Lakes. She would hold the title from when she was launched on April 9, 1927, until she was finally surpassed on June 28, 1949, the second longest reigning queen in the history of the Great Lakes. Emma Bradley, who was the wife of Carl D. Bradley, the head of the company, obviously, gave her name. Since it was Prohibition, instead of champagne, a bottle of calcite water from the company quarry was used to christen the vessel. She was the second ship to be named after the company's chief executive. The first Carl D. Bradley, launched in 1917, was renamed the SS Irvin L. Clymer and remained in service until 1990. The new Carl D. Bradley was powered by two Foster Wheeler high-pressure water tube boilers, running a turbo-electric drive that generated up to 4,800 shaft horsepower, making her one of the most powerful freighters on the lakes at the time, easily doubling the horsepower of most of her contemporaries. She entered service on July 28, 1927, and was based out of Rogers City, Michigan. Her early career proved a great success as she carried limestone from Lake Huron to various ports on Lake Michigan, Lake Erie, and occasionally Lake Superior. In 1929, she set a record for the largest limestone cargo ever carried on the lakes at 18,144 tons. Because of her size and power, she was often the first ship to pass through the Straits of Mackinac at the start of the season, serving as an icebreaker and opening up passage for the smaller ships that followed. The flagship offered better accommodations than most ships on the lakes, and she frequently carried company executives. She was a self-unloader, which meant that she was equipped with a large crane, making her capable of delivering cargo to smaller ports without shore unloading equipment. For the better part of 3 decades, the Carl D. Bradley was one of the most recognizable and celebrated freighters on the lakes. But on June 28, 1949, a new Queen of the Lakes was launched. the 678-foot Wilfred Sykes, which comfortably exceeded the length of the Bradley. While her prestige dimmed with age, the Carl D. Bradley sailed on, still a vital part of the U.S. steel supply chain, and by the late 1950s, there was no reason to believe her career would end anytime soon. On April 14, 1958, the Bradley Transportation Company celebrated a significant milestone. For 1,000 days across its entire fleet, there was not a single injury that resulted in a loss of man-hours. And since the company's founding in 1912, they had never lost a single ship. Many consider the Carl D. Bradley one of the finest ships sailing the Great Lakes, even as she was eclipsed by newer and more modern vessels. Being the company's flagship, she was held to a higher standard, always sporting a fresh coat of paint to keep her looking her best. But this mast, a rapidly aging freighter, pushed to her limits time and time again. She was one of the busiest freighters in the Bradley fleet, and she enjoyed a solid and largely uneventful career. But that soon began to change. On April 3, 1956, she collided with the MV Rose on the St. Clair River. While at first this wasn't considered a major incident, she did require repairs when she was dry docked in Chicago in May 1957. During this work, several hairline fractures, some up to 6 feet long, were discovered in her underbody amidship. These fractured sections were cropped out and replaced. While there was no formal inspection after the repairs were made, the patches were deemed satisfactory by the Coast Guard while the work was in progress. On February 26, 1958, the Carl D. Bradley was issued a new certificate of endorsement after she was inspected by Lloyd's Register of Shipping. And on April 17, 1958, she passed an annual inspection by the United States Coast Guard, which also deemed her seaworthy. But after her dry docking in May 1957, the Carl D. Bradley touched bottom on at least 2 occasions. The first of which occurred in the spring of 1958 while leaving Cedarville, Michigan. The grounding caused damage to her number 1 water bottom on her port side, just aft of her forward collision bulkhead. The damage was considered so minor that the company deemed no repairs were necessary. Then in early 1958, she once again struck bottom while turning at Cedarville, damaging her number 7 water bottom again on the port side. The collision caused an approximately 14-inch transverse fracture. The damage was repaired while she was still afloat by the company's maintenance team in Calcite, Michigan. Neither of these incidents, nor the repairs made in Calcite, were ever reported to the Coast Guard or Lloyd's Register. The Carl D. Bradley underwent one final Coast Guard safety inspection on October 30, 1958. During this inspection, the crew carried out a fire drill and a boat drill. Her crew lowered her number 2 lifeboat and demonstrated rowing, all to the inspector's satisfaction. Her captain also noted that the repairs made during her previous dry docking seemed to be holding up well, and she easily passed the inspection. But plans for an extensive overhaul of her cargo holds, bulkheads, and tank tops totaling approximately $800,000 worth of work was scheduled for the end of the season, suggesting her owners might have been aware that the aging vessel was in dire need of significant work. Her crew certainly knew. It was a common joke that the Bradley was held together with nothing but rust, and whenever the freighter encountered rough weather, they got used to the horrible sounds of rivets popping as her hull bent and twisted with the waves. But these warning signs received little attention as they scooped the scattered ligaments of their ship into buckets and carried on with their work. James Silka graduated from Rogers City High School in 1958. He was a popular student who played basketball and tennis. Like so many recent graduates, at 18 years old, Jimmy found himself at a crossroads. He wanted to go to college, but his family didn't have the money. So like his father, uncle, and cousins, Jimmy decided to get a job on the lakes. He figured he would work for a year or two to save up some money, and then he would decide where the next chapter of his life would take him. He signed up to sail on the T.W. Robinson, part of the respected Bradley transportation fleet. But he was soon invited to join the crew of the Carl D. Bradley to replace a porter that had recently left the ship. Jimmy's father was thrilled. He had experience sailing with Captain Roland Bryan, the commander of the Bradley since 1954, and he had immense respect for the man. He felt that his son was in good hands. Before he left, Jimmy's girlfriend Geraldine gave him a suitcase as a graduation gift. It was the first piece of luggage he had ever owned, having never ventured far from his home in Rogers City. "48-year-old Captain Roland Bryan was known as a heavy-weather captain. He took pride in delivering his cargo on time no matter the conditions, and this made him a very well-regarded captain in the Bradley fleet, where like most companies sailing the lakes at the time, speed and timely voyages were the top priority. But Captain Bryan privately doubted the capabilities of his ship. In a letter to a close friend, he shared concern that his ship wouldn't be able to handle rough weather, and he was relieved that she would soon receive much-needed repair work on her aging hull. To his great relief, the Carl D. Bradley completed her final planned cargo-carrying voyage of the 1958 season on November 17th when she delivered a cargo of crushed limestone to Gary, Indiana. All that was left was a quick and easy voyage north to Manitowoc for her winter layup. She departed Gary at 10 p.m. without any cargo, and took on 9,000 gallons of water in her ballast tanks for stability. The weather forecast was grim. Winds were already topping 35 miles per hour when she left port, and a rough November gale was expected as two storm systems were about to merge over the Great Lakes. But the Bradley managed just fine as she hugged the coast of Wisconsin on her journey north. She was only an hour or so outside of Manitowoc when Captain Bryan received a call that filled him with dread. Despite the worsening weather conditions, U.S. Steel ordered the Carl D. Bradley sail to Calcite, Michigan, where she would pick up a last-minute load of stone. The 1958 season had been a slow one, and much of the Bradley fleet sat idle for months. Her owners were no doubt keen to seize the opportunity to improve the numbers of a disappointing year. Captain Bryan began the challenging maneuver that would thrust his ship into the worst of the growing storm, but he took solace in the familiarity of the gale. While tough, these conditions were far from the worst that the captain and his ship had faced. He ordered the galley to prepare an earlier dinner to give his crew time to eat and prepare the ship. He knew that as they left the relative protection of the Wisconsin shoreline and headed east toward Lake Huron, they would be vulnerable to the worst of the storm as they raced across Lake Michigan. Despite the heavy weather, the mood on board was routine. This was just another crossing, and the storm prompted little concern. The majority of the crew lived in Rogers City, Michigan, right near Calcite, and they were just excited to be going home. Frank Mays was 26 years old when he joined the crew of the Carl D. Bradley in October 1958 as an able-bodied deck watchman. Frank found his first job on the lakes in June 1950, just after he graduated from high school. While in school, he couldn't wait to get a job on the boats, but after just a few months of working on the Adam E. Cornelius, he grew disillusioned. He briefly took a manufacturing job in Detroit before joining the Navy. After his 4 years of service, Frank married and took on another shore-based job. But when he learned that the Bradley Transportation Company was hiring, He moved his family back to Rogers City, Michigan, and took a job with the company. Frank didn't mind working on the lakes, but it was a job that he was never fully passionate about. Still, it was decent work, and it provided a stable living for his wife and 3 young sons. He figured he would finish out the season, and then he would take some time to decide if he wanted to continue sailing. Just after dinner on the evening of November 18, 1958, First Mate Elmer Fleming asked Frank to go below and make sure the coal bunkers were secured and watertight. The wind was already howling at 65 miles per hour, and waves occasionally broke over the deck, but the Carl D. Bradley was riding smoothly, and to Frank this was just another day at work. After securing the coal bunkers, he retreated below. He briefly ducked into the engine room and chatted with Second Assistant Engineer Al Bomer and Stoker Paul Heller. Many of the crew were Frank's neighbors back in Rogers City, and he was friends with pretty much everyone. He soon resumed his rounds and spent some time sumping water out of the aft end of the tunnel that ran the length of the ship. Severe rust in her ballast tanks and missing rivets meant that water was almost always leaking somewhere in the Bradley. But this was typical, and after a few minutes of work, Frank continued his rounds. He next went to secure the dunnage room at the forward end of the ship where paint and other deck equipment were stored. There he ran into another deckhand, Gary Price, his roommate and best friend on the ship. After securing the room, the 2 men sat down for a quick break. Their watch was ending at 8, and they knew they'd probably both be asleep when the ship arrived in Calcite. They speculated whether they would beat the Cedarville. Arriving first meant that they could go home sooner, and they hoped that Captain Bryan could pull it off. Their conversation was interrupted by a loud thud somewhere deep in the ship, followed by an intense vibration. The men knew what a ship sounded like in rough weather, but this was unlike anything they had ever heard. Within moments, the ship's alarm bell sounded. They immediately raced topside, stopping in their cabin to grab their life jackets. By the time they made it out on deck, it was clear that they were in serious danger. Frank looked out at the ship's stern, but to his horror, he saw the entire aft section of the ship rising and falling with the waves, ripping away from the bow somewhere near the 10th hatch. On the bridge, Captain Bryan, First Mate Fleming, and wheelsman Ray Kowalski were on duty, navigating through the storm when they heard the awful thud somewhere behind them. The captain and first mate raced out on deck on the port side and looked back in horror. It was normal for large ships to bend and twist in such conditions, but this was like nothing they had ever seen. Her stern flapped up and down, and the row of lights that lined her deck, usually creating a perfectly straight line, ended abruptly somewhere midship after her conveyor boom. Their ship had ripped in two. It was a moment every sailor dreads, the realization that their ship had failed them. The Bradley's pilot house almost immediately began listing to port as her bow flooded. Captain Bryan and First Mate Fleming took quick action. Bryan immediately ordered the engine stopped and sounded the ship's alarm, while Fleming jumped on the ship's radio and began sending out a critical distress call. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is the Carl D. Bradley. Our position is approximately 12 miles southwest of Gull Island. We are breaking into and sinking. Any ships in the vicinity, please come to our aid. No one responds. Fleming has no life jacket. He looks out and sees the ship's deck crew rushing topside behind the pilot house. Frank Mays is desperately working to untie the tiny life raft. The ship's two lifeboats are located in the stern. With the ship's two halves now grinding and smashing into each other, there was almost no hope that the officers and deck crew could reach the galley and engine crew housed in the stern. Their only hope is the ship's radio. Fleming repeats his desperate mayday call again and again, praying for a voice in the deafening chaos. At the WAD Marine radio station in Port Washington, Wisconsin, Ray Burnett listened to the idle chatter that echoed over Channel 51. Burnett's radio station stayed connected to the frequency 24 hours a day. While it was used for communication on the Atlantic and Pacific, as well as on the Mississippi and Ohio River, on the Great Lakes, the channel was reserved for distress calls. Most of the time, Burnett and his fellow radio operators heard nothing but the dull chit-chat between riverboat captains. But that evening, as a storm raged over Lake Michigan, the idle drone was cut by a desperate voice shouting Mayday. Burnett grabbed his microphone and shouted for other operators to clear the channel. He then asked the voice for a position. The radio crackled. Then the voice responded, 12 miles southwest of Gull Island. He scanned his map for nearby life-saving stations that could offer assistance. There was no one close. In the background roar of the radio, he hears another voice shouting orders. Run, get the life jackets. We're breaking in half, get the life jackets, we're sinking. Burnett began calling other ships in the area. He then contacted nearby Coast Guard stations. At this point, the best hope of saving the men on the Bradley was extending the distress call as wide as possible. On the other side of the lake, at the Coast Guard station in Charlevoix in western Michigan, Chief Boatswain Joe Etienne was on duty when he picked up the Bradley's distress call. The frantic Mayday gave their position and then suddenly cut out. Etienne tried to contact Elmer Fleming for more details, but he heard nothing. The two spoke only a few moments prior, and all seemed well. But Etienne knew that conditions on the lakes could change in an instant. His calls to the Bradley were met with silence. Elmer Fleming's distress calls were heard on radios all over the lakes. On Lake Huron, another ship in the Bradley transportation fleet, the John G. Munson, was struggling through the storm to reach Rogers City. The Munson replaced the Bradley as the longest ship in the fleet when she was launched in August 1952. She was only about half an hour outside Calcite when the Mayday call crackled over her radio. Both Second Assistant Engineer Charlie Horn and oiler George Meredith had brothers on the Bradley. Charlie's brother Paul loved working in the Bradley's engine rooms and hoped to soon follow in his brother's footsteps and earn his third assistant engineer's license during the winter layup. When he heard about the distress call, George remembered with horror a conversation he had had with his brother Dennis only 1 week before, when Dennis, 4 years older than him, took him out for drinks to celebrate his 21st birthday. While younger, George actually had more experience sailing than his older brother. When Dennis left the Army, he considered going to business school, but George convinced him to get a job with the Bradley Transportation Company to earn some money first. Now, all he could do was think about a question his brother had asked him over drinks. Do you think the Bradley is seaworthy? Do you think it'll break in half? Taken aback by his brother's question, George asked him what he meant. Dennis described the twisting and groaning of the hull in rough weather, the leaks in the rust, and the popping rivets. But George shrugged off his brother's concern. How would a big boat like that sink, he asked, and the conversation quickly moved to something else. A similar anxiety played out on the Cedarville and the T.W. Robinson, both having crew with relatives on the Bradley. In the tight-knit community of sailing families, it was almost inevitable. Now all they could do was wait and hope. For most of the day, Captain Paul Mueller of the 256-foot German freighter Christian Sartori was fighting through one of the worst storms he had ever experienced in his 6 years sailing on the lakes. As they passed through the Straits of Mackinac and moved along the northern coast of Upper Michigan, things only got worse. The steamer was designed to handle the North Atlantic, but she was only able to make 2 to 3 miles per hour as she was lashed by the wind and waves. Then, somewhere in the maelstrom, Captain Mueller spotted the lights of a large limestone carrier. He calculated that they would pass the freighter in about an hour, and he ordered a slight course adjustment to provide plenty of room for a safe port-to-port passage. But only a moment later, his second mate, Jurgen Swan, called out, "The lights are going out on the forward part of the ship." Mueller grabbed his binoculars, and to his horror, he saw the giant freighter go completely dark from her bow to just before her aft superstructure. Then the lights in her stern flickered out as well. Mueller's heart sank for his fellow mariners. A power failure in a storm like this could be catastrophic. Suddenly, the barely visible silhouette of the stricken ship erupted in a giant red and yellow ball of fire, followed soon by the sound of a massive explosion that broke through the roaring storm. Then the flames seemed to slip below the waves. Captain Mueller checked his radar, but the ship was gone. He immediately directed his ship to sail for the scene of the explosion, knowing that despite their proximity, it would be at least an hour before they could reach any survivors. The Carl D. Bradley began splitting in two at around 5:31 p.m. Her hull sank beneath the waves of Lake Michigan only a few minutes later. With so little time to react, her crew of 35 had almost no chance of survival. From the moment Captain Roland Bryan realized that his ship was breaking up, he did everything he could to save his crew. He ordered the engines stopped and then sounded 7 short blasts, followed by 1 long blast from the ship's horn, the signal to abandon ship. Over the radio, his voice was heard by multiple operators shouting at various crew members to run and put on their life jackets. As the ship ripped apart, the buoyancy of her bow and stern section changed. Her stern, with the heavy engines and boilers low in the hull, maintained its center of gravity, and for a time it remained on an even keel. But the bow, with its heavy boom on deck, immediately became top-heavy without the stern or cargo to anchor it, and it immediately began to capsize. Around half a dozen men gathered on the pilot house deck as it began toppling into the waves. Frank Mays worked desperately to untie the single tiny life raft. Soon the ship's electric cable snapped, plunging the bow into darkness and cutting Elmer Fleming's desperate mayday calls short as the radio died. In the chaos, the lights of the stern seemed to offer some kind of refuge. Second mate John Fogelsonger made a dash for the stern. He tried to jump between the two halves as they heaved in the waves, but he missed, dropping into the darkness of the gap. When the radio went silent, Elmer Fleming's attention turned to saving his own life. He realized that there were no more life jackets nearby. Another crew member handed him a life ring, but this wouldn't be enough to save him. He knew that he would have little chance of surviving in the water regardless, but without a life jacket, he would have almost none. In a daring gamble, he raced below to retrieve the life jacket stored in his cabin, running down 2 decks in total darkness as the ship rolled around him. Up on deck, as the bow increasingly listed to port, Captain Bryan shouted to his men to climb to the highest point to keep them out of the water as long as possible. But the moment the men began scaling the ship's railing, a massive wave swept over them and the bow rolled violently, sending almost everyone flying into the water. As the bow plunged down, Frank clung to the life raft. He couldn't get it free in time, so now his only hope was that it would automatically break free as it was designed to when it plunged into the waves. But as his body slammed into the frigid water, the shock of the cold and the impact ripped him away from the life raft. He was dragged deep below, but after what felt like an eternity, he finally resurfaced. He heard the sounds of other men screaming in the torrent of the storm, and the awful sounds of the mighty ship meeting its end. The bow was gone, but Frank could clearly see straight into the cargo holds in the stern as it filled with water. The break was so clean it looked like a giant cleaver had sliced through the ship. His life jacket helped keep his head above the water, but it took considerable effort to keep it on as each wave crashed over him, forcing his body down while the cork jacket shot up. In a stroke of luck, he soon came across the meager life raft, and with considerable effort he lifted himself onto the tiny platform. The raft had no oars, and it was easily tossed around in the massive waves. But it kept him mostly out of the water, giving him precious time before hypothermia could set in. Incredibly, Elmer managed to find his life jacket in the darkness. He quickly raced back on deck just as the bow took its final plunge. But before he could do anything, the ship lurched over and he was thrown 20 feet in the air as he was flung into the water. When he resurfaced thanks to the buoyancy of his life jacket, he was only a couple of feet from the same life raft that Frank clung to. He climbed on, and the two men began shouting for the other men in the water, hoping to guide them to the raft. Soon they saw Gary Strzelecki swimming toward them. Another deck watchman, Gary was one of the most physically fit men on the ship, and he was widely considered to be the best swimmer. He climbed on the raft, but in a panic he insisted that he needed to go back in and find his brother-in-law, wheelsman Ray Kowalski. He said he couldn't imagine facing his sister if he survived and her husband did not. But after considerable convincing by Elmer, the only officer on the raft, he reluctantly agreed to stay put. Not long after, they came across deckhand Dennis Meredith, and with great struggle they lifted him on the raft. Unlike the other three men, Dennis was asleep in his cabin when the ship began breaking up, and he didn't have time to put on warmer clothes as he raced topside. He wore just a light sweater and pants. His feet were bare. He was already in a state of shock and shivering violently as he was lifted onto the raft. The other men huddled around him to try and warm him up. They heard other voices crying out for help, and for a moment they spotted wheelsman Mel Orr. But he was almost immediately swept away. The Bradley's stern still towered over them, its forward end slowly pulling the remains of the ship nearly vertical. It paused for a moment and then began its final plunge. As the boilers reached the cold water, a massive explosion rocked the crippled ship as it dropped below in a haze of fire and steam. The four men on the raft were alone on Lake Michigan as the storm raged around them. Elmer Fleming knew that there was another ship nearby, close enough to witness the death of their ship. He told the others that while it might be a while, help was certainly on the way, lifting their spirits considerably. He pulled a flare from the raft's small supply box and lit it, hoping that the bright red sparks would guide their rescuers to them. Their modest pontoon-style raft consisted of only two 8x10-foot wooden platforms attached on either side to large red barrels. While the craft was rated to hold up to 15, it was hard to imagine that it could support anyone else. It was a constant challenge trying to keep the raft from flipping over in the massive swells. It was equipped with a small supply chest that contained 3 flares and a sea anchor, which the men quickly deployed. Fortunately, it seemed to do its job, keeping the craft from flipping over with every wave. Fleming soon lit a second flare. Gary Strzelecki did what he could to help lift the men's spirits. He called out warnings whenever he spotted a particularly large wave heading toward them, and helped rally the men to hold out just a little bit longer. Gary was widely admired both for his instincts and his unique personality. He loved to draw, and he loved comic books. He spent much of his free time making art, a quality that stood out amongst his peers. Him and his wife Anne had a 3-month-old son back home at Rogers City, and Gary was determined to make it back to them. After about an hour, they saw the lights of a ship drawing toward them. The ship was rolling up to 50 degrees in the heavy surf, and the sailors on the raft couldn't help but be impressed by the seamanship on display before them. When it was only around 100 yards away, Fleming grabbed the last remaining flare to help guide their rescuers to the raft. But when he pulled off the cap and attempted to spark it, nothing happened. He desperately tried again and again, but the flare was too waterlogged to ignite. On the Sartori, Captain Mueller had his men line the railing, searching for any traces of the ill-fated vessel or her crew. About an hour before, he saw flashes of red appear in the distance and then fade away. Surely these must have been survivors. But when they reached the scene, they found nothing but a single tank floating in the water. After sweeping the area, Captain Mueller called Ray Brunette at the radio station in Port Washington and reported that they found no survivors. He suspected that the ship went down with all hands. The ship's searchlights swept by the men on the raft, leaving them in darkness as they fell into yet another trough, hiding them from view as their rescue ship passed by them. They watched helplessly as the Christian Sartori, their only hope of saving, sailed by, leaving them alone in the vastness of Lake Michigan. When the Bradley went down, a similar scene of chaos ensued on her stern. As the ship broke apart, Hardy Felix, Al Bomer, and Pete Horn desperately tried to launch one of the two 25-person lifeboats, but it was hopelessly tangled in the falls. They tried to cut the steel cables with an axe, but no matter how hard they tried, it wouldn't break free. The lifeboat on the other side of the ship was rendered useless by the angle of sinking. Those who managed to get out of the engine room in time raced on deck only to find nowhere to go as the lights flickered out and the stern lifted high into the air, the bow already vanishing beneath the waves. Their final moments are a mystery. With no lifeboats, the men had nothing but the emergency life raft attached to her bow, a craft that couldn't support more than a few of them, if they were even able to find it. As the stern began its final plunge, an explosion of fire and steam ripped out of her funnel as her hot boilers plunged into the cold water. Most of the men in the stern were likely killed in the sinking, and those that survived were stranded helpless in the churning water. After the Sartori steamed away, hope on the small raft dimmed. One particularly large wave crushed into them and overturned the craft, sending all four men plunging back into the water. Gary, Elmer, and Frank all managed to pull themselves back on the raft, but Dennis Meredith, already barely conscious, was only able to cling to the side. The men were too weak to pull him up. And a few hours later, Elmer realized that Dennis's face was in the water. He pulled his head up, only to realize that the man was dead. He lifted his arms from the raft and let him float away. His body was never found. Soon the effects of hypothermia began setting in for the other three men. Gary Strzelecki was the first to begin slipping in and out of consciousness. Frank and Elmer did their best to keep him alert, but just before daybreak, Gary began mumbling about swimming to shore, convinced he could make it. The other two tried to stop him, but he pushed his way off the raft and began swimming away. Now, it was just Frank Mays and Elmer Fleming alone on the raft as the first lights of dawn broke over the horizon. The moment the Bradleys' mayday calls echoed over the radio, life-saving stations in the area began organizing search and rescue efforts. The storm and area of sinking made these operations difficult. The life-saving station at Plum Island deployed a 36-foot boat, but the crew was unable to make any headway in the storm, and they were soon forced to shelter near Washington Island. At the Coast Guard station in Charlevoix, the 180-foot cutter Sundew was by far the best-equipped vessel in the area to mount a search, but much of her crew was on shore leave at the time. Through an incredible effort by Captain Harold Muth, she was ready to sail within an hour of receiving the distress call, and she arrived on the scene at 10:40 p.m. to join the Sartori in the search for survivors. The Coast Guard cutter Hollyhock from Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin joined them on the scene at 1:30 a.m. The conditions were brutal, with the storm still raging over the area. All the while, relatives of the Bradley's crew rushed to the Coast Guard station in Charlevoix, knowing that the survivors would be brought there first. But hope of locating any of the Bradley's crew dimmed as the night turned to morning and the sun crested over the horizon. Captain Muth knew all too well that it was unlikely anyone, even in a proper lifeboat, could survive the night in these conditions. Standing near him on the bridge was watchman Richard Sellison, scanning the horizon through binoculars, when he suddenly called for the captain's attention. He wasn't sure what it was, but he saw something bobbing in the water. Captain Muth took the binoculars, and soon a small raft with 2 men on it came into view. Captain Muth and his crew began the delicate operation of transferring the 2 men onto the ship. The Sundew was brought alongside the raft to offer protection from the waves. Crew then climbed down cargo nets, and 2 of them gently stepped onto the raft and secured lines to their ship before gently lifting the 2 barely conscious men onto the deck of the Sundew. Incredibly, both men were soon brought back to full consciousness. They insisted that the Sundew remain in the area and continue searching for survivors rather than sailing back to shore for full medical care. Not long after picking up Frank and Elmer, a helicopter spotted an overturned lifeboat. The Sundew raced to investigate, but when they found the boat, it appeared unused. It likely broke free from the ship during the sinking, but it seemed that no one found it. In total, 18 bodies were recovered. 15 were never found. In addition to the bodies picked up, rescuers found a number of life jackets that were fastened but empty, suggesting that the men wearing them slipped out of them sometime in the night. Everything that night was against them. Rogers City, Michigan was hit hard by the sinking of the Carl D. Bradley. A majority of the crew lived in the tiny community, and nearly everyone lost either a friend or a relative in the tragedy. 23 women were widowed, and 53 children lost their fathers. 2 unborn babies would never know their dad. Frank Mays and Elmer Fleming managed to make full recoveries and share their stories. But there were still many unanswered questions, and an investigation was quickly launched by the Coast Guard Marine Board. Their findings concluded that the Bradley sank from excessive hogging stresses, and concluded that Captain Bryant exercised poor judgment when he decided to leave the protected coast of Wisconsin and sail for the open lake during the storm. They issued a series of recommendations, including changes to make it easier to launch lifeboats in an emergency, additional life rafts, additional flares that could be fired in the air, and life jackets that included crotch straps and collars to support the neck. But both Elmer Fleming and Frank Mays were adamant that the Bradley split in 2. Their claims were widely accepted, and the Commandant of the United States Coast Guard, Vice Admiral A.C. Richmond, issued his own report contradicting the Marine Board's findings. He concluded that Captain Bryant did not exercise poor judgment, and based on reports that the ship was riding fine in the storm, he did not take any extraordinary risk. Instead, the Bradley sank after breaking up due to an undetected structural weakness or defect. The controversy over what exactly happened raged on. If the Bradley sank in the storm due to poor seamanship, the accident could be considered an act of God, relieving U.S. Steel from any liability. But if she did indeed break up, they could be at fault for operating an unsafe ship. Less than 1 year after the disaster, in 1959, the United States Army Corps of Engineers located the wreck using sonar, laying 5 miles northwest of Boulder Reef, just south of Gull Island. U.S. Steel quickly commissioned a survey of the wreck using underwater cameras. The murky footage produced by the expedition appeared to show the Bradley resting on the lakebed intact, supporting their claim that the tragedy was indeed an act of God. But it's worth noting that this survey was conducted in secrecy without any impartial witnesses overseeing the work. A settlement was reached 1 year and 16 days after the accident, in which U.S. Steel gave $1.25 million that would be divided amongst the victims' families. The settlement was incredibly fast, and it did not provide lifelong support. The tragedy left many families in a dire financial situation. having lost their only source of income. Frank Mays was adamant about what he witnessed that night. In 1995, he joined an expedition that sought to dive the wreck once again and finally proved that the Bradley broke up. But poor visibility made it impossible to verify. During the dive, Frank was able to place a plaque on the wreck to honor his fellow crewmen. They would try once again. In 1997, the same team sent an ROV to examine the wreck. Finally, they were able to observe the break in her hull, exactly where Frank and Elmer described it. Frank later wrote, "I saw it go down in 2 pieces on the surface, and now I've seen it in 2 pieces on the bottom of Lake Michigan." Frank Mays lived long enough to share his story with the world. He wrote a book about that night and spoke frequently about the disaster. He passed away in 2021. To me, the story of the Carl D. Bradley is the story of the men who worked on her. For some, it was another chapter in a long career on the lakes. But for others, it was just a job to tide them over before they moved on with their lives. Young men like James Silka, an 18-year-old discovering the world for the first time. His body was never found. When the Carl D. Bradley broke up on Lake Michigan in 1958, the lives of these men were considered expendable. It wouldn't be until the loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald nearly 2 decades later that a culture of safety would finally become normal on the lakes. But for well over 100 years, countless lives were lost for no reason, leaving thousands of holes in the tight-knit communities that sent their sons out on the lakes, praying that they would return. On the night of November 18, 1958, Bob Belmore, crewman on the limestone carrier Cedarville, listened anxiously for news of their fleetmate, the Carl D. Bradley, where his brother Doug served as a porter. Both the Cedarville and the Bradley were due in the port of Calcite that night, and both were fighting the same violent storm. Only one would survive. All but 2 on board the Bradley, including Bob's brother Doug, would lose their lives that night. A few years later, in 1964, one of the Bradley survivors, Elmer Fleming, was scheduled to take command of the Cedarville. But only moments after stepping aboard, Elmer left the ship for good. He would never sail again. Only 1 year later, the Cedarville would meet her own tragic fate. In 1927, the Great Lakes Engineering Works shipyard in River Rouge, Michigan, the same yard that would build the Edmund Fitzgerald 30 years later, was commissioned to build a new bulk carrier for the Pittsburgh Steamship Company, a subsidiary of the United States Steel Corporation. Labeled hull number 255, the new freighter was designed to carry iron ore. She wouldn't be the largest on the lakes, but she would come close, with a length of 603.9 feet or 184 meters, and a beam of 60.2 feet or 18.3 meters. Launched on April 9, 1927, she was originally named the A.F. Harvey. The Harvey was nearly identical to several of the bulk carriers that entered service at around the same time. She was equipped with large box-shaped cargo holds designed to efficiently deliver iron ore to steel mills. Her power was generated by 3 coal-fired Scotch marine boilers that fed a single triple expansion engine that could achieve 2,200 horsepower. She was operated by a crew of 35. The A.F. Harvey entered service in May 1927, but only a year into her career she ran into trouble near Detroit, Michigan. Shrouded in heavy fog, she collided with the whaleback steamer John Erickson. While damage to the Harvey appeared minimal, the Erickson had to be beached to prevent the ship from sinking. The Harvey was able to reach Detroit under her own power. Repairs were made, and she was soon returned to service. The Erickson was also refloated and repaired. She was briefly re-registered to the home port of New York, though she never left the Great Lakes. In 1956, she was transferred to the Bradley Transportation Fleet, part of the Michigan Limestone Division of U.S. Steel. Her registry was returned to the port of Duluth, Minnesota, though she operated out of Rogers City, Michigan. During her winter layup at the end of 1956, she underwent a major overhaul at the Defoe Shipbuilding Company in Bay City, Michigan. This refit converted her from an iron ore carrier to a self-unloading limestone and coal carrier. Her cargo holds were equipped with a new hopper bottom and 2 conveyor belts that ran the length of the ship. These would carry stone to a forward-mounted bucket elevator that lifted materials to a 250-foot self-loading boom mount just aft of her forward cabins. While this equipment reduced her overall cargo capacity, it made her significantly more efficient and versatile, able to deliver cargo pretty much anywhere without the need for costly and slow shore-based unloading equipment. As part of the refit, she was painted gray to match the Bradley Fleet livery and renamed Cedarville after the port in Michigan. The Cedarville was also equipped with a modern new funnel. She re-entered service at the start of the 1957 season and operated alongside her new fleetmate, the slightly larger Carl D. Bradley. Elmer Fleming's unexpected departure from the Cedarville on March 27, 1964 reshuffled the ship's deck crew. First mate Martin Joppich, a sailor with 18 years of experience on the Great Lakes, was elevated to captain. While Joppich was liked by his crew, some found his sudden promotion a mystery. An even greater mystery is why exactly Fleming left the ship that day. Some believe that the foul weather at the time triggered the trauma that he experienced when the Bradley went down years before. While he had been to sea since, the disaster left him with a nervous disposition. Who wouldn't after surviving what he did? Maybe there was something about the Cedarville that didn't feel right. Either way, the ship's new captain assumed command and completed the season. In October, Joppich grounded the ship in the St. Mary's River. The ship required dry docking to patch the damage. By the start of the 1965 season, it was clear to the crew of the Cedarville that her hull was rapidly aging. As far back as the spring of 1961, a Coast Guard inspection found serious deterioration of her hull plating and ordered replacements of the affected areas, starting 80 feet aft of the bow on both sides. Her hull was made up of 3/8-inch steel plating. These plates proved susceptible to corrosion, causing thinning, pitting, and other signs of weakness. Because the cost of the repairs ordered by the Coast Guard would exceed $124,000 and could potentially disrupt the Cedarville's busy schedule, the previous captain requested permission to delay the repairs until a more convenient time. The request was granted, and the work was put off. Officials from Lloyd's Register of Shipping subsequently pushed the Bradley Transportation Company to invest in the repairs after urging from the ship's insurance underwriters. But these repairs were pushed off indefinitely. Even when the Cedarville was dry docked after grounding in October 1964, the company refused to invest in replacing her weakened hull plates. In 1961, the ship was reboilered, improving her efficiency and slightly increasing her power. This was the last major work done on the ship before the 1965 season. Captain Joppich and his crew were well aware that the 40-year-old ship was showing her age. But these issues were easy to ignore. These ships were strong, and experienced captains prided themselves on pushing them to their limit. The Bradley Transportation Fleet was responsible for delivering limestone to the vast U.S. steel empire, a vital ingredient in steelmaking, used to remove impurities during the blast process. Captains in the fleet were given extremely optimistic schedules and tonnage requirements with no regard for weather or the complications of operating an aging ship. While it was ultimately up to the captain to keep his crew safe and decide if they left port, it was clear that missed deadlines, low tonnage numbers, and costly maintenance work could end a master's career with the company. The culture of prioritizing profits over safety was pervasive on the lakes and continued well after even high-profile losses like the Carl D. Bradley and the Daniel J. Morrell. So while Captain Joppich, still a relatively new captain in the fleet, probably would have preferred new hull plating, he decided that the ship was seaworthy, and the Cedarville began the 1965 season with a hefty increase in the tonnage required by the company that year. But the weather didn't care about U.S. Steel's limestone quotas, and a cold front soon swept through the region. The recently cleared Straits of Mackinac rose over, and despite Captain Joppich's efforts, the Cedarville found herself iced in. She would have to wait until April 1965 when the weather began to finally cooperate to truly get the season underway. After a handful of successful runs, Captain Joppich relaxed a bit, but the pressure to keep up was ever present, and no doubt played a constant role in his mind.
Now more than ever, it is important to bring together quickly and efficiently the jobs to be done and the men and women who can do them.
In April 1965, another vessel half a world away left Denmark bound for the American Great Lakes by way of the St. Lawrence Seaway. Commanded by Captain Rasmus Högland, the 6-year-old MV Topdalsfjord was constructed in Gothenburg, Sweden, and operated by a Norwegian shipping company. The 6,000-ton, 423-foot, or 129-meter-long cargo ship was built to withstand the fury of the North Atlantic and the brutal North Sea. Her bow was reinforced to break through ice, and she was powered by a single diesel engine that could achieve 6,500 horsepower. Her 5 cargo holds were loaded with European goods bound for Canada and the United States, and she was scheduled to return to her home port of Oslo, Norway, with a load of grain from Chicago and Port Arthur. Opened in April 1959, the St. Lawrence Seaway allowed ships with drafts as deep as 26.9 feet or 8.2 meters to operate between the Great Lakes and the Atlantic Ocean, giving access to much larger ocean-going vessels. The Topdalsfjord arrived in the Great Lakes in mid-April 1965 after battling a series of squalls on the North Atlantic. She would spend the next few weeks navigating the series of congested locks and waterways that connected the Great Lakes as she unloaded her cargo and prepared for her return voyage. By the morning of May 7th, she was sailing up Lake Michigan bound for Port Arthur, Ontario. The night before, a heavy fog had set in over the Straits of Mackinac, reducing visibility to only a few hundred feet. So dense that captains of the long lake freighters couldn't even see the aft ends of their ships as they made their way through the fog. Captains had to rely on their radios, radar, and the rules of the sea, as well as their senses as they listened for foghorns in the eerie abyss. Still, they plowed forward, anxious to keep on schedule. The Topdalsfjord was no different as she sailed east. Captain Högland monitored the situation closely, manually operating the ship's fog whistle himself, letting out 3 short blasts at regular intervals in keeping with Great Lakes regulations as they neared the shadowy outline of the Mackinac Bridge that loomed somewhere in the fog. At the end of each school year, recruiters from the Bradley Transportation Company would visit Rogers City High School looking to sign new crew members for their Great Lakes fleet. For young graduates who couldn't afford or didn't have the grades or desire to attend college, a job on the lakes could be a pretty solid gig. Room and board were provided during voyages, there was plenty of time off, and the pay was decent. Many young men would spend a couple of years on the lakes while they saved up money and planned the next chapter of their lives. For others, it was the start of a lifelong career. When Dave Erickson graduated in 1959, he signed on with the shipping company. New crew members were placed wherever they were needed, and for the first couple of years, Dave moved around from the deck crew to the engine room. He eventually realized that off-duty weeks tended to be more consistent for galley crews, and a few years into his career, he became a porter on the Cedarville. His job involved tending to the captain's and chief engineer's room, the officer's dining room, and helping prepare meals. Before dawn on May 7, 1965, Dave reported to the Cedarville in Rogers City, Michigan. The ship was scheduled to carry 14,411 tons of open hearth limestone to Gary, Indiana. The ship left port at 5 a.m., giving Dave some time before his shift started at 7, so he went to his bunk and took a quick nap. The mood on board was cheerful. The crew loved overnight breaks in their home port where they could spend the evening with friends and family. After a quick breakfast, Dave headed to the captain's cabin to begin his shift. As he headed forward, the fog was so thick that he couldn't see the other end of the 600-foot ship. The foghorn blared at regular intervals. It was cold, around 41 degrees Fahrenheit. As he finished his work up front, he headed back aft to help in the galley. He could hear the foghorns of other ships as they neared the straits. The ship had a vegetable bin on the port side of the main deck, just outside the galley. Dave stepped out to get some potatoes when another porter, Jerome Kersick, said, "Hey Dave, look at this." Dave joined him at the railing and looked out to where Jerome pointed near the bow of the ship. A dark mass loomed in the fog, heading straight for the ship. The Cedarville let out a long blast just as the ship emerged from the fog and slammed into their port side. Dave didn't remember much noise from the collision, only that the ship shuddered like it had been struck by a large wave. The ship's bow remained lodged in their side as the Cedarville continued forward. Dave and Jerome watched for a moment, and then realized that they should go below and grab their life jacket. They shared a cabin and quickly got prepared as the ship's warning alarm began blaring. Dave then went to the cabins around him to make sure that no one was sleeping. As he returned to the deck, he heard the sound of the other ship finally break free and scrape along the side of the Cedarville. It passed so close that he could almost reach out and touch it, before it once again disappeared into the fog. He briefly visited his boss to tell him what happened before heading forward to get a better look at the damage. Some of the railing and deck plates were buckled, but most of the damage seemed to be below the waterline. He could hear water rushing into the ship beneath him. The deck crew lowered an emergency collision tarpaulin over the damaged area to try and slow the flooding, but the hole was too large and the tarp was almost immediately sucked into the ship. A port list was developing, and water was pumped into the starboard ballast tanks to level out the ship, but it was clear to Dave and the rest of the crew that the Cedarville was in serious danger. The order was given to begin preparing the lifeboats while the captain made an attempt to beach the ship. Dave reported to his assigned station at lifeboat number 1 on the starboard side, and helped uncover and lower the boat to the main deck. He looked to the bow, barely visible in the fog. The forward decks were already awash, and the ship was beginning to list the starboard. Some of the starboard ballast tanks were venting water. Cedarville was already making her final plunge. The crew remained calm but moved urgently as the bow pushed below the waves and the ship rolled further to starboard. Dave jumped into the lifeboat, joining several of his crewmates. But as soon as he got into the boat, he heard shouts that it wouldn't release from the falls. In a split-second decision, he jumped into the water just as the ship abruptly capsized, rolling on top of the boat and the crew members inside it. In the water, Dave felt the shudder as the Cedarville's bow hit the lake bed and the roar of her limestone cargo spilling out of the ship. After what felt like an eternity, he finally made it to the surface. The cold water made it hard to catch his breath. He looked for the ship, but he only saw about 150 feet of the bottom of her hull. He saw the portside lifeboat still attached to the capsized ship. Another crewman desperately banged at its releases with an oar, finally releasing the boat just as the Cedarville disappeared beneath the waves. As he watched his ship vanish in the churning lake, the reality of what just happened set in. Dave was cold and numb, held up by just his life jacket. He could hear the sounds of foghorns from other ships in the distance. He heard men screaming for help all around him. Finally, he saw a life raft and swam toward it. The men on the raft helped lift him out of the water. He was already too weak to pull himself up. Once he was on the raft, he tried to warm himself up. His crewmates threw ropes in the water and helped others climb aboard the raft. Enveloped by the surreal soup of fog, the men waited. On the bridge that morning, Captain Joppich commanded the Cedarville as they sailed for the Straits of Mackinac. Visibility was about as bad as it could get, but the ship continued forward with the help of RCA radar and a radio direction finder to help establish a position. The ship was also equipped with a gyro compass and a standard radio telephone that was manned by the captain. All of the navigation, communication, and operating equipment was in working order. While visibility progressively worsened since leaving Calcite, Cedarville continued up Lake Huron at full speed, approximately 11.7 miles per hour. As they neared the Mackinac Bridge, Captain Joppich established contact with the downbound Benson Ford. A passing arrangement was verbally agreed upon, and the two ships safely passed about half a mile apart from each other. The fog at the time was so thick that none of the Cedarville's lookouts could see the Benson Ford as they passed. About 3 or 4 miles from the Mackinac Bridge, Captain Joppich made radio contact with a German vessel called the Weissenberg and verbally established a port-to-port passing agreement with her captain Werner May. As the Weissenberg passed under the bridge, Captain May warned them that there was a Norwegian vessel not far ahead of them, heading for the Cedarville. Captain Joppich tried to contact the ship, but he was unsuccessful. Third mate Charles Cook, who watched the radar screen, warned that the other ship was getting closer. Accounts of what happened on the bridge over the next few minutes differ. Captain Joppich would later claim that he had already reduced his speed to slow ahead, but there's no other record of this, and others on the bridge at the time, including wheelsman Leonard Gabriziak, maintained that the ship was only reduced to half speed after failing to make contact with the Norwegian vessel. They could now clearly hear the other ship's fog whistle on the Cedarville. As the range between the two ships decreased, Captain Joppich ordered a change in course, turning to the right. But the other ship continued forward. He then let out one long blast to signal a port-to-port passing. Tension mounted as the captain continued trying to reach the other ship by radio. Then, the lookout stationed on the port bridge wing shouted out, "There she is." Another lookout stationed on the bow saw her too as the ship emerged from the fog. He shouted, half a block away. By then, wheelsman Gabriziak could see her too, only about 100 feet ahead of them and closing in fast. Captain Joppich immediately ordered slow ahead. Just as he issued the order, Charles Cook shouted, "Captain, we're going to hit." In a last-ditch effort to avoid the collision, Joppich ordered full ahead and a hard right turn. But it was too late. On the Topdalsfjord, Captain Hoagland sailed at a reduced speed as the distance between the two ships closed. He maintained his heading and ordered his engines dead slow, only about 3 or 4 knots. They could hear the other ship's fog signals ahead of them. It appeared that they would pass on their starboard side. Captain Hoagland stood outside the wheelhouse door on his starboard bridge wing when he heard the long blast of a ship's whistle. Suddenly, the Cedarville appeared in the fog, only about 250 feet away, passing right in front of them. Hoagland ordered his engines reversed, but again, it was too late. The reinforced bow of the Topdal's Fjord sliced into the Cedarville at an almost perfect right angle on her port side at her number 7 hatch at 9:55 on the morning of May 7, 1965. Her bow remained lodged in the ship for a few moments before the Cedarville's forward momentum pulled the two ships apart. The Cedarville then disappeared into the fog. Despite her damaged bow, the Topdal's Fjord's crew was unharmed, and the ship was not in any serious danger of sinking. Her 2 lifeboats were launched to search for survivors, but no one was found. After a few hours, it was confirmed that other ships were able to aid the Cedarville, and the damaged Norwegian ship sailed to Sault Ste. Marie. They were lucky. The true horror transpired only a few hundred feet away in the fog. It was clear to Captain Jobbich that the damage to his ship was serious, but in the moments after the collision, he felt that it was possible to save the Cedarville. He ordered the engine stopped and sounded a general alarm, then radioed a mayday message and dropped the ship's port anchor. The accident was reported to the Mackinac Island Coast Guard Station and the nearby Weissenberg. Soon, Captain Jobbich learned that the ship was taking on a tremendous amount of water, and the emergency collision tarpaulin failed to slow the flooding. He then ordered all crew not assisting in the engine room or bridge to report to their muster stations and prepare the lifeboats. Then Captain Jobbich decided that he would make a run for it and try to beach the sinking ship. The anchor was raised and the engines were ordered full ahead. The starboard ballast tanks were filled to try to even out the list. But instead of heading for a closer beach or shoal, Captain Jobbich set his sights on Mackinac City. Third mate Charles Cook quickly plotted a course that would prove both wrong and hopelessly over-optimistic. The nearest shallow, Graham Shoal, was only about 1 mile away and perhaps reachable, while Old Mackinac Point was an out-of-reach 2.2 miles away. The forward motion only pushed the Cedarville's bow deeper, and it was abundantly clear that the ship would be gone in only a matter of minutes. Still, no order to abandon the ship was ever given. Soon the Cedarville began listing to starboard as her bow plunged deeper. Leonard Gabriziak was the only one on the bridge to don a life jacket immediately after the collision. As he escaped the flooding ship, he saw third mate Charles Cook struggling to put his life jacket on. He lost sight of him when the ship heeled over. Charles Cook's body was never found. Captain Jobbich was pulled from the water, clinging to his life jacket. Immediately after receiving the Cedarville's distress calls, Captain May on the German freighter Weissenberg followed the ailing ship closely. While they could not see the ship go down in the fog, they knew what happened when the Cedarville disappeared from their radar screen, and they immediately launched their lifeboats to search for survivors. Dave Erickson's raft was soon pulled alongside the Weissenberg. The German crew helped them aboard and immediately gave the men blankets and warm clothing, as well as hot coffee and tea. As Dave warmed up and regained his senses, he saw the German sailors performing CPR on some of his fellow crew members. 2 would die on the Weissenberg from shock and hypothermia. Out of the 35 crew members on the Cedarville, 10 lost their lives. All but 1 of the engine crew on duty at the time went down with the ship. The survivors were soon transferred to the Coast Guard cutter Mackinac and brought to local hospitals. Dave was treated for his injuries and then driven home to Rogers City, where he was reunited with his wife and 2 children. He and his fellow survivors spent the rest of their lives trying to understand what happened that day. In the immediate aftermath of the sinking, U.S. Steel went into overdrive to protect its reputation after yet another one of its ships met an untimely end. The loss of the Carl D. Bradley was still fresh in people's memory, and another accident blamed on poor maintenance could prove costly. Fortunately for them, the aging, underpowered, poorly designed ship, along with their lack of a safety culture, was easily overshadowed by the actions of Captain Joppich. While U.S. Steel initially tried to blame the accident on the crew of the Topdalsfjord, an investigation by the United States Coast Guard quickly turned its focus to what happened on the Cedarville. U.S. Steel's lawyer attempted to invoke the Fifth Amendment or the right to remain silent on behalf of Captain Joppich, but a federal judge ruled that the plea did not apply under maritime law, and the captain had to submit to questioning. His testimony not only contradicted the testimony given by other surviving crew members, but he also contradicted what was recorded in the ship's logs and other documentation. The inquiry found his testimony to be self-serving and largely false. Ultimately, it was ruled that Captain Hoagland and the Topdalsfjord operated with reasonable caution given the conditions, by reducing their speed and observing established maritime passing rules. Blame for the accident and loss of life fell on Captain Joppich, and he eventually pleaded guilty to the charges against his master's license. It was determined that the Cedarville, moving at her top speed, was sailing far too fast given the low visibility and volume of ship traffic. Captain Joppich failed to establish a radar plot or follow established track lines, despite ample warning over radio, radar, and through fog signals that another ship was approaching. Once the collision occurred, Captain Joppich failed to realize the gravity of the situation, and while his intention to ground the ship was reasonable, he failed to establish their position and plot a course to the nearest shallow. He squandered those critical moments when he might have been able to save all of his crew and his ship. Perhaps most damning, he failed to issue an order to abandon ship. Nearly all of his engine crew remained at their stations long after it was abundantly clear that the ship was doomed. Though he avoided criminal liability, Captain Joppich was stripped of his master's license. He would never sail again. Questions remain over the level to which U.S. Steel and its culture of profits over safety at the time contributed to the disaster. Many victims' families maintained that the company created an unsafe work environment and questioned whether Joppich was ever fit to serve as a captain in the first place. Legal battles over liability stretched on for years. The inquiry also determined that the crew of the Weissenberg acted heroically. Captain May remained in the area even after Captain Joppich declined his help immediately after the collision. They acted quickly to get men out of the water as soon as possible. With the low visibility and cold temperatures, it's all but certain that the death toll would have been significantly higher if not for their actions. But in the end, the Cedarville became just another casualty of the lakes, overshadowed by greater horrors. The wreck lies upside down on the bed of Lake Huron, a popular, albeit dangerous diving site, a ghostly reminder of the risks sailors take every day to move our world forward. "26-year-old deck watchman Dennis Hale was asleep in his cabin on the Daniel J. Morrell when a dull thud jolted him awake. He rolled over in his berth, thinking that the sound was just an anchor hitting the hull, and he nearly drifted back to sleep when another, much stronger bang rocked his cabin, sending his books flying off the shelf. He sat up and reached to turn on the lights, but the switch didn't work. Something was wrong. He jumped from his berth just as the ship's general alarm blared a dire warning. Wearing only boxer shorts and a life jacket, Hale raced out on the spar deck. What he saw filled him with horror. Looking aft through the maelstrom, the Morrell's stern was missing. Then, as the ship heaved with the heavy seas, the ship's stack and aft deckhouse rose from below, lights still shining, heaving high above him. Their mighty ship had torn in two. Dennis Hale and his crewmates had only 8 minutes before they would be thrown to the mercy of Lake Huron. Only one of them would survive. In the mid to late 1800s, demand for iron and steel skyrocketed as the United States rapidly industrialized. This need for raw materials created lucrative opportunities for shipping companies on the Great Lakes, fueling a boom in large bulk freighters. The Cambria Steamship Company, a subsidiary of the Cambria Iron Company, was formed in 1906 to manage a new fleet of vessels for the growing Pennsylvania-based iron and steel producer. The company commissioned 2 nearly identical vessels that would be built in tandem. The Edward Y. Townsend would be constructed by Superior Shipbuilding in Superior, Wisconsin, and the Daniel J. Morrell would be constructed by West Bay Shipbuilding in West Bay, Michigan. The Townsend was launched on August 18, 1906, and the Morrell followed only a few days later on the 22nd. Both were named after executives of the Cambria Iron Company. Daniel Johnson Morrell became superintendent and manager of the company in 1855, shortly after its founding. In addition to sporting an impressive neckbeard, he also served 2 terms in the United States House of Representatives before he passed away on August 19, 1885. At the time of her launch at 603 feet or 184.6 meters, the Daniel J. Morrell was dubbed Queen of the Lakes, the unofficial title given to the longest vessel serving on the Great Lakes. She was quickly eclipsed by the William B. Kerr, which was launched on December 29, 1906. 6 different vessels held the title in 1906, showing just how quickly newer and larger vessels were entering the lakes at the time. While her size was noteworthy, the Daniel J. Morrell's design followed what was by then very standard on the lakes. Designed to carry iron ore, she came in at 7,239 gross registered tons when built, and was powered by 2 Scotch Marine boilers that fueled a triple expansion steam engine that could produce 1,878 horsepower. She was operated by a crew of 29. Not long into her career, the Morrell sideswiped another bulk freighter, the Henry Phipps, in heavy fog on Whitefish Bay on August 13, 1909, causing severe damage to both vessels. Repairs to the Morrell cost an estimated $10,000, but she was quickly returned to service. 2 years after their launch, the M.A. Hanna Company, one of the largest iron shipping companies on the lakes, took over management of the Morrell and the Townsend. In 1923, Cambria was sold to the massive Bethlehem Steel Corporation, and the 2 ships soon passed to the Bethlehem Transportation Company, a subsidiary of the steel giant. Aside from her early collision with the Phipps, the Daniel J. Morrell's 60 years on the lakes were productive and largely uneventful. In 1922, she became the first bulk carrier on the lakes to use a gyro compass. In 1945, she was reboilered with 2 Babcock and Wilcox boilers. And in 1956, she underwent a major refit that replaced her power plant with a new 3-cylinder Skinner Uniflow engine, nearly doubling her horsepower. While she was showing her age, the Morrell easily passed her routine Coast Guard inspections. Lake freighters served extraordinarily long careers, and it looked in 1966 as though the Daniel J. Morrell would serve for many years to come. On the evening of November 26, 1966, Dennis Hale arrived at the Bethlehem Steel Plant in Lackawanna, New York, just in time to watch the Daniel J. Morrell sail away. This was likely the Morrell's final voyage of the season, and if Hale, a deck watchman on the iron ore carrier, missed the boat, he would lose his annual bonus in vacation pay, totaling around $6,000 to $7,000, which was a significant portion of his annual pay. Dennis Hale was no stranger to tragedy. Born on January 23, 1940 in Cleveland, Ohio, his mother, Ruby Hale, died in childbirth, He was quickly sent to live with his aunt, but he began running away at a young age and hitchhiking all over the country. He was big and he was tough. In the 1950s, he joined the Army. And after his service, he found a job on the Daniel J. Morrell in 1964. He wanted to work in the galley, but it turned out that he was better suited for a job with the deck crew. When he first saw the old ship, he was unimpressed, and he wondered if she was even seaworthy. While he was wary at first, he quickly grew to love life on the lakes and the camaraderie he found with his fellow crewmates. When the Morrell arrived in Lackawanna in late November, she had to wait for 2 other vessels before she could begin unloading her cargo. This gave Hale an unexpected opportunity to visit his home in Ashtabula, Ohio, and spend some time with his family. He requested a short leave while the ship waited to unload, but he misjudged how long it would be before the Morrell could set sail for Minnesota. It was already very late in the season. Typically, the Morrell would be laid up by this time of year, but a last-minute run had been added by the ship's owners, and Captain Crowley was eager to finish the voyage as quickly as possible. Hale watched the lights of the Morrell disappear on Lake Erie, and then he went to the Coast Guard station and radioed the captain. He was joined by another deckhand, 21-year-old John Graw, who also missed the Morrell. Already short on hands, Captain Crowley had little choice but to excuse the absences. The Morrell was scheduled to take on a load of coal at the Mullen Dock near Windsor, Ontario the following day. Hale and Graw could rejoin the ship there. Thankful for the reprieve, the 2 men loaded into Hale's car and began the long drive to Ontario, where they would board the Daniel J. Morrell for her final run of the 1966 season. They call it the Witch of November, the month that has claimed more lives than any other. When winds can shift in an instant and waves build out of nothing, crashing relentlessly into ships one after another in a phenomenon called the Three Sisters. November marked the end of the shipping season when weather and ice blocked the lakes from even the largest of freighters. Tensions ran high in those days as captains tried to meet their quotas and get off the lakes before the Witch of November could claim them. November 1966 started cold on the Great Lakes with higher than average snowfall, but by the middle of the month, temperatures rose considerably, creating a warm and mild Indian summer. But Arctic air soon descended once again in the last week of the month, plunging the region into a cold and stormy winter. The month saw record snowfall, and blizzard conditions stranded hundreds after the Thanksgiving holiday, with the storm continuing over the coming days. In 1966, the Daniel J. Morrell was commanded by Captain Arthur Crowley. Crowley took his first job on the lakes when he joined the crew of the Lebanon the day after he graduated high school in 1937. He lived in Rocky River, Ohio, with his brother John and his widowed sister Mary. In late November, he called his siblings to tell them that the Morrell's owners in Cleveland ordered an additional late-season run to meet tonnage commitments. He told them that it had been a rough season and he would be glad to put it behind him and finally return home. Captain Crowley was never particularly fond of life on the lakes, but he continued on nonetheless. Dwight Boyer's book, Ships and Men of the Great Lakes, recounts that he once told a friend, "There comes a day when you realize that you have too much time invested, too much equity, so to speak, to make a change." Late-season runs were challenging, but above all else, men just wanted to be home with their families and friends. But a significant share of their pay was tied to completing the season, and so they had little choice but to follow company orders. The Daniel J. Morrell left Lackawanna on the evening of November 26, 1966, bound for Taconite, Minnesota, where she would pick up one last cargo. Her sister ship, the Edward Y. Townsend, followed only a few hours behind. The weather was grim. For days, a brutal storm lashed at the region, but for the first leg of their voyages, the Townsend and the Morrell managed to skirt along the edge of the storm. On November 27th, both ships stopped at the Mullen Docks near Windsor, Ontario to take on a load of coal. Dennis Hale and John Graw joined the Morrell not long before she departed at 7:30 on the morning of November 28th. From Windsor, the Morrell sailed for Lake Huron. The Townsend was under the command of Captain Thomas Connolly, a man with nearly as much experience as Captain Crawley. The two kept in close contact as they sailed north, both well aware that this would be a challenging run. While they found the southern end of Lake Huron relatively calm, the Weather Bureau had issued a gale warning. As the hours passed and the two ships made their way up the lake, the wind grew stronger and waves were building. But both ships were handling well, and neither captain saw much reason for concern. But change came quickly. By that evening, the two ships faced winds exceeding 50 miles per hour, rapidly building waves in blizzard conditions. The Morrell ran around 15 miles north of the Townsend. Both ships were rolling heavily as they struggled to stay on course. Waves came in 250 to 300 foot intervals, putting enormous strain on the 600-foot freighters as their bows and sterns repeatedly rose and fell with the punishing sea. The propellers now routinely lifted out of the water, causing overspinning, forcing their engineers to reduce power to prevent damage. At around midnight, Captain Connolly told Captain Crowley that he was considering seeking shelter to ride out the storm, and he wondered whether it'd be better to head to Thunder Bay or turn south and head for Port Huron. Captain Connolly was increasingly concerned with how the Townsend was handling. He ordered his crew not to travel between the forward and aft end of the ship. On the radio, he told Captain Crowley that he was concerned his ship would fall into a trough, a position he feared she would not be able to recover from before being swamped by the growing waves. Connolly made one last call to Crowley at 12:15 a.m. By now, winds exceeded 65 miles per hour and waves were routinely breaking over the deck of the Townsend. Crowley shared Connolly's concern. He was also struggling to keep the Morrell on course some 20 miles or about 2 hours north of the Townsend. The two captains wished each other well and ended the call. It would be the last time Captain Connolly would ever speak to Captain Crawley. After finishing his shift for the night, Dennis Hale retreated to his cabin to get some sleep before his next shift started at 4 a.m. the following morning. To wind down, he read from Carl Sandburg's Lincoln, a recommendation from his sister. The Morrell pitched and rolled, but Hale was used to the movements of a lake freighter, even in heavy seas, and he soon drifted off to sleep. At around 2 a.m., he was jolted awake by the sounds of the Daniel J. Morrell ripping in two. As he raced on deck to find out what was happening, he ran into 51-year-old deck watchman Al Womey. When the two men made it on deck, Womey shouted, "Oh my God," and ran back to his cabin to grab his life jacket, leaving Hale alone to watch as the mighty ship cracked at her keel and tore in half, metal tearing and sparks flying in the torrent of the storm. Hale knew that his ship was doomed. He raced back to his cabin to put on more clothes to protect him from the deadly cold, but in the urgent darkness, all he could find was a peacoat. He put it on over his life jacket and ran back on deck, where a small group had gathered around the emergency life raft secured between the third and fourth hatches. The ship's two lifeboats were located on her stern. Even if they could reach them, the raging storm rendered them useless. The pontoon-style raft was designed to float free from the ship in an emergency. It consisted of 2x4s secured to large metal barrels. It was rated to hold 50 men, but it was hard to imagine how the meager craft could even support half that number for a meaningful amount of time. The small group was soon joined by Captain Crowley. He told them that the pilot house lost power before he could send an SOS, but the Townsend should only be about 15 miles away. He told them to use the raft's parachute flares to alert their sister to their plight. As the bow and stern ripped away at each other, he confessed that they shouldn't have been out there. The storm was far more severe than he had anticipated. The ship's stern remained deserted, and they wondered if the engine crew even knew what was happening. Then, through the icy rain and snow, they saw oiler Don Worcester step out on deck. He stood staring forward and barely moved. Then, with a great shudder, the two halves of the ship finally separated. The bow, now significantly lighter, tossed and rolled as waves 25 feet or higher washed over it. For a moment it seemed the stern, with its lights still shining and its cargo holds open wide, glowing red as water was pouring in, would crash into the bow. Its engine still pushing the shattered ship forward. Just as it seemed that they could be consumed by the dumb gnashing stern, the aft section passed to the side, running almost parallel to the bow. But there was no sense of relief. Almost as soon as the stern rode past them, a wave swamped over the bow and dislodged the raft, throwing the men into the churning sea. Hale plunged deep into the cold, disorienting water. The shock momentarily robbed him of his senses, but he followed the bubbles that lifted all around him and finally made his way to the surface. He saw a bright light in the distance and instinctively swam toward it. The life raft was equipped with a carbine light designed to illuminate in the water. It guided Hale forward, and after what felt like an eternity, he finally reached the raft. Deckhands Art Stojek and John Cleary Jr. were already in the raft, and they helped him climb aboard. The two men, probably in shock, were not much more prepared for the cold than Hale. Stojek wore his pajamas, and Cleary wore jeans and a sweatshirt. Hale was the most experienced of the three, and seemed the most level-headed in that moment. They soon spotted another man swimming toward them and helped wheelsman Charles Fuzzy Fossbender into the raft. Fossbender was on duty at the time and he was the only one fully dressed, but he too seemed to be in shock. Together the men watched as the bow settled into the water only a few yards away. Stranded on the pathetic raft, their dire situation settled in. They clung to hope that the Townsend or some other ship would soon find them, but for now they were alone in the darkness. And no one even knew that they were out there. On the Edward Y. Townsend, Captain Connolly kept his radio tuned to Channel 51, the frequency reserved for distress calls. It had been almost 2 hours since he had heard from Captain Crowley on the Daniel J. Morrell, but Connolly held out hope that Crowley's radio simply failed in the storm. After a difficult night, the Townsend seemed to have survived the worst of the storm. The following afternoon, as she limped on, approximately 45 inches of water was discovered in her cargo hold. Connolly initially assumed that this was normal leakage from a ballast tank. The Townsend was then ordered to stop at Lime Island in the St. Mary's River to take on bunker fuel. As the crew surveyed the ship, they found numerous loose rivets and a crack in her number 10 hatch. The damage was troubling, but nothing too alarming. Her owners reported the damage to the Coast Guard and then ordered the Townsend to sail at a reduced speed for Sault Ste. Marie, where she would receive a more thorough inspection. The Daniel J. Morrell broke in two at approximately 2 a.m. on November 29, 1966. She was not reported missing until 12:15 on the afternoon of November 30th, 34 hours after her crew had been thrown to the mercy of Lake Huron. While the Morrell failed to call in their required report on the previous day, since no distress call had been sent out, her owners assumed that there was nothing to worry about. The Townsend made it through the same storm, and it was thought that the Morrell likely just sustained damage to her radio equipment. But after calling several captains in the area and still receiving no word of the missing freighter, concern slowly grew. After she failed to arrive in Taconite, Minnesota, the Coast Guard was finally alerted to the situation. Only a short time before the call was made, the freighter CG Post made a grisly discovery 8 miles north of the Harbor Beach Breakwater Lighthouse, when they found a body floating face down in the water. He wore an orange life jacket bearing the words, Daniel J. Morrell. It wasn't long before the Morrell's crippled bow finally settled into the water and disappeared beneath the waves of Lake Huron. The four men on the raft desperately searched its tiny locker, looking for anything that could help keep them alive. Hale knew that there should be a sea anchor and a can of oil that could help stabilize the raft and keep the sea around them calm. Every wave that washed over them was followed by a brutal wind that chilled the men to their bones. Hale finally found the anchor, which he quickly deployed, giving them some relief. But delirious with shock and the onsets of hypothermia, one of his fellow sailors threw the oil can into the churning lake. Soon the men stirred with excitement, pointing to a light in the distance. Hale looked up, but with disappointment he realized that they were looking at the ill-fated stern of the Morrell, still sailing away from them. It would travel for approximately 90 minutes, covering about 5 miles, before it too finally submerged. The final moments of the men trapped on board will always remain a mystery. "What do you think our chances are?" asked 20-year-old John Cleary. "A lot better than the guys who didn't make it on the raft with us," Hale replied. Cleary was the second youngest crew member on the Morrell, and the one Hale identified with most on the raft. Charles Fassbender and Art Stojek were both considerably older. Stojek supported not only his wife and 4 children, but also his wife's parents. Without him, they had nothing. Hale fired off a series of flares, but after the second one sputtered in the air, much lower than Hale had hoped, and disappeared in the waves, the flare gun broke. It could only be fired if it was awkwardly held together. Realizing that there was no one close enough to see the reddish-orange lights, Hale and the other 3 men settled in. In the darkness, Hale prayed that he would die. His bare legs had lost all feeling, and he put his hands in his mouth to try and keep them warm. Periodically, he would stir the other men awake. He knew that sleep would bring death. Soon it was dawn, and the gray sky lit up to reveal their desperate isolation, with nothing but water in all directions. John Cleary lay face down in the raft. Hale nudged him, and then panic swept over Hale as he realized that he might be the last man alive. But to his relief, Fassbender replied, still clinging to life. The 2 men tried to stay optimistic. They speculated that help had to be coming soon, though neither knew for sure whether anyone was even looking for them. In the morning light, Hale realized that Fassbender had been seriously injured when he escaped the sinking ship. His chest and shoulders were crushed, and while he seemed in good spirits, he had developed a deep, hacking cough. The 2 men didn't speak much. A few hours later, Fassbender sprung up. He said he could see land. Hale saw it too, but he knew that they were too weak to paddle the raft anywhere, and even if they could reach land, neither had the strength to walk anywhere. They would be just as stranded as they were now. As dusk began to fall, Fassbender's cough grew worse. He said it felt like something was blocking his lungs, and Hale suggested that he try to cough it up. Fassbender braced himself and hacked violently, but nothing came up. He tried again before collapsing. He was dead, and Hale was alone. It grew dark, and Hale realized that he was about to face another night out there. By now the raft had drifted only a few hundred feet from the shore, but Hale didn't have the strength to move. He saw the lights of a house in the distance. He called out for help, but he was too weak and far away for anyone to hear him. He looked at his frozen crewmates. The sight of John Cleary, a young man with his whole life stolen away from him, filled him with rage. And Hale, a religious man, cursed God for making them suffer like this. By the next afternoon, Hale was in the advanced stages of hypothermia. He picked ice from his coat and ate it to try and stave off dehydration, before suddenly an old man in a white robe with a bluish tent appeared before him and told him to stop. The man that Hale decided to call Doc then disappeared. As he drifted in and out of consciousness, he soon felt himself lifting into the sky. He drifted to a cloudy land that he had never seen before, filled with light and vivid colors. Across a bridge, he saw relatives who had passed away, smiling at him with warmth. He saw his mother, the woman who died giving birth to him. He saw events from his life, happy and sad. Doc appeared once again and told him that everything that happened to him had taught him something about life. Hale hugged his mother, and a strange feeling washed over him, knowing that she was just a stranger. He then saw his fellow crew members. They hugged him one by one, happy to see him. They all seemed innocent and childlike. Everyone was happy and laughing and filled with joy. He later said that when he was in the clouds, all he could feel was love. But then the Morrell's third mate, George Dahl, turned to Hale and asked him what he was doing there. He said, "It's not your time. You have to go back." And with that, Hale was back in the raft, filled with pain and numbness, rocking with the unforgiving waves of Lake Huron. Hale knew it would be dark soon, and he feared that he wouldn't make it a third night. But then, he heard a noise. Suddenly, a helicopter hovered over him. Hale wondered if it was just a hallucination, but then two men sloshed through the knee-deep water and reached out to his raft. He was too weak to move. At around 4 p.m. on November 30th, 1966, rescuers carefully lifted him into a helicopter. All Hale could do was tell them that he loved them. He repeated it again and again. It was all that he had the energy to do. Dennis Hale spent 38 hours on the raft. His rescue was nothing short of a miracle. The loss of the Daniel J. Morrell sparked outrage and launched a series of investigations. It was eventually concluded that the aging ship broke in two due to brittle steel used in her construction, a common issue with ships built prior to 1948. When the Townsend was inspected, the damage discovered was far more extensive than previously thought. Numerous fractures, some old and some new, were found throughout her hull. Her sailing papers were revoked, and she spent the next 2 years in layup awaiting her fate. Finally, the Edward Y. Townsend was sold for scrap, and she eventually was towed unmanned, bound for a scrapyard in Spain. But on October 7, 1968, she broke free from her tugboats in a storm on the North Atlantic. Before she could be recovered, she split in half at almost the exact same spot in her hull as the Morrell and quickly sank, ironically not far from where the Titanic was lost. The Morrell disaster taught officials that lifeboats were useless when a ship goes down in a storm on the lakes, and there was a dire need for equipment that could help stave off hypothermia. While the loss of the Morrell was eerily similar to the loss of the Carl D. Bradley a decade before, it wouldn't be until the loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald that the dangers of shipping on the lakes garnered wider attention. Dennis Hale was brought to a nearby hospital. His injuries from the sinking and prolonged exposure required extensive surgeries, but ultimately he survived. For years he refused to talk about what happened on the Morrell. He couldn't understand why he survived while 28 other men lost their lives. Racked with survivor's guilt, Hale eventually sought the help of a therapist who suggested that he try sharing his story. From then on, Hale made it a mission to share the story of the Daniel J. Morrell and the crewmates who lost their lives that night. He wrote 2 books about his experience and gave numerous interviews. The work gave him purpose. On September 2, 2015, his life was taken by cancer. He was 75.
winter, the waterways open to traffic, and life takes on a quickened tempo. Now the streams leap and roar, and the great harvest of logs, cut in the winter and piled on the ice, continues its journey from the forest to Shipwrecks.
1909 was a deadly year on the Great Lakes. A long and brutal winter stretched long into the shipping season, battering ships with a series of brutal snowstorms. By the end of April, at least 5 ships met an untimely end. On April 7th, the fishing tug George A. Floss vanished during a storm on Lake Erie. Her wreck was discovered about a month later in 50 feet of water, 7 miles north of the Cleveland harbor. When divers opened her cabin door, they found the bodies of 2 of her 7 crew members. The other 5 were never found. On April 20th, the steamer Eber Ward sank only a few minutes after her bow was caved in by a heavy ice floe on Lake Michigan, 6 miles west of Mackinac City. 5 of her 14 crew members went down with the ship. On April 30th, a brutal snowstorm swept over the lakes. In the whiteout, the bulk barge Arania grounded on Point Iroquois in Whitefish Bay on Lake Superior. Her crew was able to refloat her, but she was almost immediately trapped in an ice floe and soon began to sink. Her 3 lifeboats were launched, but they were quickly abandoned, and her crew of 20 men walked 3.5 miles across the ice to where they were finally picked up by the steamer J.H. Bartow. The crew of the schooner barge George C. Nestor was less lucky. Under tow by the steamer Schoolcraft, the unloaded barge broke free in the storm and foundered near Huron Island on Lake Superior. All 6 crew members were lost. That same storm would leave one enduring mystery that would haunt the lakes for years to come. This is the story of the loss of the Adella Shores. Before iron ruled the Great Lakes, lumber was king. As the United States developed, there was an enormous demand for lumber, and by the mid-1800s, much of the forests in the east had already been depleted. As the nation moved west, the forest was seen as a barrier to development and a rapid source of wealth. This led to a major boom in lumber-rich states like Michigan, which became the nation's largest lumber producer between 1869 and 1900. The state was abundant in white pine, which was ideal for both lumber and transportation because it could easily float, unlike hardwoods. At the time, logs were mostly floated down rivers, where they were processed in sawmills and then loaded on ships that carried materials throughout the Great Lakes. By 1897, over 160 billion board feet of lumber was logged from Michigan forests, and by the end of the century, the state was all but depleted, and the logging industry gradually moved to the Pacific Northwest. The strong market for both grain and lumber led to a shipbuilding boom on the lakes that began in the mid-1800s. Schooners were initially the most popular, but as steam became more viable, bulk freighters with boxy wooden hulls with a raised forward pilot house and aft deck housing soon became the norm. Even as iron and steel hulls became standard, wooden hulled freighters continued to be built through the turn of the century. In 1894, the Lynn Shipyard Company in Gibraltar, Michigan began construction on a new wooden hulled lake freighter for the Shores Lumber Company. Originally called the Wolverine State, the new vessel seemed cursed from the start. At her launch on May 29, 1894, a miscommunication caused her bow lines to be cut before her stern lines. This caused her bow to slide into the water while her stern was still attached, dragging her stern onto the slipway, damaging her keel, rudder, and stern post. The half-launched ship had to be hydraulically lifted back onto the slipway so she could be properly launched a few days later. Unsurprisingly, she almost immediately began to sink by the stern. Shipyard workers had to use hand pumps to keep her afloat long enough to be towed to the nearby Clark dry dock, where the damage was repaired. She was then sent to the Detroit dry dock where her boiler, smokestack, engines, and other machinery were installed at the Riverside Iron Works. But the botched launch was not the only possible bad omen. The Wolverine State was christened by the owner of the company's daughter, Bessie Shores, and named for her sister, Adella Shores. Since the family was staunchly opposed to alcohol, a bottle of water was used instead of wine or champagne. But water has historically been used to christen many ships in the past, so I'll let you decide whether or not this counts as an adequate offering to the gods of the sea. By July 17, 1894, the Adella Shores was completed. She was modestly sized, coming in at about 195 feet or just under 60 meters in length. Operated by a crew of 14, she was initially commanded by Captain James J. Carr. Almost immediately, the Adella Shores ran into trouble. On August 4th, on the return leg of her first run, she sailed into a major storm on Lake Superior. The massive waves and fierce wind swept 75,000 board feet of lumber from her deck, and the vessel soon began to flood. But Captain Carr managed to ride out the storm. He later remarked that the ship's machinery performed well. She was quickly repaired and returned to service. But only a month later, she ran into trouble once again. On September 14th, while sailing from Chicago to Ashland to pick up a load of lumber, she ran aground on the Skilly-Gully Reef near the Straits of Mackinac on Lake Michigan. She was towing a barge called the Constitution at the time, but they managed to avoid the reef and sailed to safety. No one was injured and the crew was soon rescued, but the Adella Shores was gravely damaged. Initially, it was thought that the ship would be a total loss, but once again, she was refloated, repaired, and returned to service. By the end of the 1800s, the lumber industry was all but over in the region, and the Adella Shores only spent 3 seasons with her original owners. She was soon sold to the Neff Transportation Company and began carrying various other cargo throughout the lakes. In 1905, Captain Samuel Holmes took command of the ship, and he went with her in the winter of 1908 when she was sold one last time to the Mannix Transportation Company of Cleveland, Ohio. But her time with her new owners would be tragically brief. Much is said about the November gales on the Great Lakes, but early season storms take a deadly toll of their own. In the spring of 1909, a series of brutal storms passed over the lakes, exacting a heavy toll. The Adella Shores was commanded by Captain Samuel Holmes, her master for the last 5 years. Holmes immigrated to the United States from Norway in 1890 at the age of 16. He immediately took to the lakes after arriving in the States and gradually rose through the ranks before captaining his own ship. The 35-year-old captain was not just the ship's master. He was also a part owner as of her sale in the winter of 1908. Being a part owner, he had an even greater interest in getting his ship underway as soon as possible. So while conditions were less than ideal, with winter weather stretching well into the spring of 1909, Captain Holmes brought the Adella Shores out of her winter layup in Grand Haven, Michigan in April and prepared her for what he hoped would be a prosperous season. By 1909, the lumber industry in the region had all but dried up, and the Adella Shores was used to carry a variety of bulk cargoes instead. On this voyage, she picked up 9,000 barrels of salt from Ludington, Michigan, and sailed north, bound for Duluth, Minnesota. Ordinarily, the heavy ice would have kept wooden-hulled freighters in port for a few more weeks at least, but Captain Holmes was eager to get underway. As soon as reports indicated that a navigable path had been cleared by the larger and stronger steel-hulled freighters, the Adella Shores began her voyage. This was risky, but Captain Holmes was confident in his ship. His brother Olaf served as his first mate, and there was no doubt a sense of optimism that this would be the start of a thriving family shipping business. At 1:15 p.m. on April 28th, the Adella Shores reached the Straits of Mackinac. The weather was decent, with clouds and a light east wind. Much to his relief, Captain Holmes found this leg of the voyage easygoing. The larger steel-hulled freighters had indeed carved a path through the ice that the smaller Adella Shores easily followed. At 12:30 a.m. on April 19th, she passed through Sault Ste. Marie and entered Lake Superior. As they steamed into Whitefish Bay, they soon encountered the nearly brand new 603-foot Daniel J. Morrell. One of the largest freighters on the lakes at the time, the less than 3-year-old Morrell's size, power, and steel hull was much better suited to the icy conditions. Both ships were headed up Lake Superior, and Captain Holmes no doubt felt a sense of relief as he followed the path cleared by the Morrell. But his sense of relief would be short-lived. By 7:30 that evening, as the two ships rounded Whitefish Point, a heavy gale swept over Lake Superior, bringing growing swells, lashing winds, and heavy snow. On the Daniel J. Morrell, Captain Millen kept sight of the smaller ship following in their wake as he fought through the storm. But soon, visibility worsened. The Adella Shores seemed to be veering further to the west, perhaps seeking shelter closer to the shoreline. Now almost 2 miles behind the Morrell, the Adella Shores disappeared in the maelstrom. Captain Millen would be the last person to see the small wooden freighter for over 100 years. As the late April storm cleared, the 1909 shipping season began in earnest. Numerous ships set out for their first voyages as the ice began to thaw. By the morning of Tuesday, May 4th, the weather improved considerably. First Mate Spaulding of the wooden-hulled steamer Simon Langle had just begun his watch when he spotted something in the distance in the first light of dawn on Lake Superior. Soon, they were surrounded by wreckage. He called Captain Gill to the bridge, and the two men observed 50 to 100 small pieces of decking and part of a shattered skylight. They saw deck planks painted slate on one side and tarred on the other. It was clear that they were sailing through the gravesite of some unlucky ship, probably a wooden-hulled freighter similar to their own. Then Captain Gill pointed off to starboard and said, "Look at that." Spaulding looked to where the captain indicated and saw the broken pieces of a pilot house about 1,000 feet away. "That's the Adella Shores," remarked the captain. "I know it well." Spaulding agreed that it must have been the Shores. The Langle was 12 miles north-northeast of Grand Island. While it was initially hoped that the Adella Shores had grounded somewhere in the storm or sought shelter in some remote inlet, it was clear now that the freighter and the 14 souls on board were lost in the storm. Captain Millen of the Daniel J. Morrell thought that the small freighter was done in by a large slab of ice, churned up by the storm. Her wooden hull would have easily caved under the force, and the Adella Shores likely went down fast. Numerous other ships soon reported debris over the coming days and weeks, but no bodies were ever found. The most haunting trace of the lost freighter was a roughly 20-foot square of decking. A single oar bearing the name Adella Shores was lodged into the makeshift raft and probably used as a rudder. While the raft's occupant was long gone, his coat remained. A Union card belonging to able seaman Peter Olson was found in the breast pocket. What exactly happened to Olson and the 13 other men on board that night remained a mystery, and the tragedy of the Adella Shores soon faded from memory, one of the many victims of Lake Superior's fury. But then in the summer of 2021, Director of Marine Operations of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society, Daryl Artell and his brother were using side-scan sonar to run grids on Lake Superior when they came across a large object resting on the lake bed. Ertel knew the story of the Adella Shores, and the moment he measured the wreck and observed its design, he knew that it must be the long-lost freighter. Further analysis of the wreck confirmed its identity. The finding was announced in May of 2024. Ertel's work and the efforts of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society offer a poignant look at the long-forgotten freighter. Her story is being told once again. While the last moments of Captain Holmes and his crew remain a mystery, we finally know their last resting place. Captain Frederick John Burke was known as a heavy weather captain. He was one of the grizzled old-timers who trusted their ship more than any weather forecast. One of those who understood that it was their job to deliver their cargo no matter what the lakes threw at them. In 1940, life on the lakes had changed very little since the large steel freighters were introduced more than half a century before. These ships were simple and efficient. While their faults were well known, they were frequently pushed to their limits. But men like Captain Burke knew what their ships could handle. That's why Captain Burke's actions on the night of May 1st, 1940 baffles historians to this day. As an unexpected gale overtook Lake Superior, he sailed through the open lake, leaving his ship vulnerable to the storm. Despite questioning from his crew who knew that they were headed for disaster, Captain Burke, seemingly in some kind of trance, refused to change course. When his ship finally succumbed to the elements, and his crew fled to the lifeboats, Captain Burke remained on board as his ship surrendered to Lake Superior. The wreck of the Arlington was finally discovered not long before the making of this video. But the mystery of why Captain Burke went down with his ship endures. This is the strange story of the SS Arlington. The SS Arlington left the Horn elevator dock at Port Arthur, Ontario on April 30th, 1940, carrying 98,000 bushels of wheat. She sailed for the Great Lakes elevator in Owen Sound on Georgian Bay. It was early in the 1940 season, and the Arlington recently passed inspection, demonstrating that while she was going on 30 years of service, she was perfectly seaworthy. The Arlington was constructed at the Detroit Shipbuilding Company in Wyandotte, Michigan. Designated hull number 192, she was launched with the name F.P. Jones in 1913. She was a typical canaler designed to navigate the narrow St. Lawrence River locks. She measured 244 feet or 74.4 meters in length, with a beam of 43 feet or 13 meters. She was powered by a coal-fired triple expansion steam engine that could achieve a top speed of around 10 knots. She was sold to new owners in 1919 and renamed the Glen Cadam. She enjoyed a relatively uneventful career for the next few years, proving herself a capable and reliable vessel. In 1925, she was purchased by the Matthews Steamship Company and renamed the Arlington. A decade later, she was sold one last time to the Burke Towing and Salvage Company. The Canadian shipping company, owned by Captain Dave Burke and his brother Edward Burke, operated a modest fleet consisting of a few barges and a tug. The Arlington was an ambitious step toward expanding their business. She was commanded by Captain Roderick Graham, a well-respected veteran who was nearing the end of his career on the lakes. When he announced that the 1939 season would be his last, Dave and Edward Burke turned to their brother, Captain Frederick John Burke. The two brothers had long sought to bring their brother into the business, but Captain Burke was going on 25 years with the Playfair fleet. Loyal to his longtime employer, Burke wasn't exactly keen to join his brothers. But when Captain Graham retired, he relented, taking command of the Arlington at the start of the 1940 season. when she left Port Arthur in April of 1940, a large freighter called the Collingwood departed at almost the same time. They anticipated normal weather for the voyage. Cold and overcast with north to northeast winds and some light snow. But as the two freighters crossed Thunder Bay and sailed into Lake Superior, the clouds overhead darkened and the winds picked up. At first, the Collingwood sailed comfortably ahead of the Arlington, but not long after the two ships passed Trowbridge Island Light, Captain Thomas J. Carson of the Collingwood reduced his speed and allowed the smaller steamer to take the lead, as they were soon enveloped in snow and fog. While the Collingwood was larger and faster, the Arlington was equipped with a direction finder. Rather than sailing blind, Captain Carson could follow Captain Burke with reasonable confidence they wouldn't get lost in the building storm. But his confidence in his fellow captain would soon prove to be misplaced. Captain Frederick John Burke was born in Midland, Ontario on June 12, 1885. As a child, he struggled with a severe speech impediment that left him unable to pronounce the nickname his family had given him, Teddy. When he tried to say his name, Teddy Burke, it came out as Tadybug. The mispronounced name stuck, and eventually it became a nickname that he was proud of. Tadybug Burke was known for his big personality and uneven disposition. He was rough-talking, erratic, and impulsive, but he was also generous with his crew, and he was known to run a happy ship. While he had a reputation for risk-taking and was often referred to as a heavy-weather captain, his navigation skills were top-notch. In 1940, there was no reason to doubt that Captain Burke would make an excellent master for the Arlington. Joining him for the first time on this voyage was first mate Junius Maxey. With 32 years on the lakes, Maxey had the experience to serve as a captain himself. He was on watch that afternoon as the Arlington left Thunder Bay and entered Lake Superior. As the sky grew darker and the wind and waves swelled, it became clear that the weather reports were wrong. When fully loaded, the Arlington had only 3.5 feet of freeboard, the distance between the waterline and her deck. Maxey knew that this would make them vulnerable to even moderate swells if they weren't careful, and he prudently ordered a course change hugging Lake Superior's north shore. While this would add additional time to the voyage, the shoreline would offer valuable protection from the north and northeast winds. It was a logical order that any experienced lake captain would also make. But just as the wheelsman began turning the ship north, Captain Burke stepped into the pilot house. While he was known to be well liked by his crew, this was the first time most of these men had served under him. There were no pleasantries. Captain Burke observed the course change and immediately contradicted the order, telling the wheelsmen to instead sail directly for Whitefish Point, a course that would take them through the middle of Lake Superior, leaving them exposed to the worst that the building gale could throw at them. Flabbergasted, Maxey responded, "You just think you're going to Whitefish?" But to this, the captain simply muttered something incoherent and then shuffled out, returning to his cabin where he would remain for most of the night. As darkness fell, the sea state continued to worsen, with swell after swell breaking over the deck of the Arlington, battering at her hatch covers. Second mate Arthur Ferris inspected the hatches at 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. and found them in good shape. Both times he reported his findings to the captain, who remained held up in his cabin, and both times the captain barely muttered any real response. While the captain didn't seem too concerned with the growing storm, there was an uneasy sense among the crew that they were needlessly sailing into an increasingly dangerous situation. But for the moment, no one dared to challenge the captain's authority, and the Arlington continued. The Collingwood followed, running about 10 minutes behind. By 10 p.m., the wind had reached gale force, and even though she had significantly more freeboard, Captain Carson was concerned to see waves occasionally wash over the decks of the Collingwood. At 12:30, he ordered his speed reduced and settled in for a long and trying night. First Mate Maxie arrived in the pilot house for his watch at 12:15 that night, anxiously aware that his captain, who remained holed up in his cabin, had steered them into the heart of an unrelenting gale. While the hatch covers had been properly secured before they left, Maxie watched with concern as every wave washed over the deck, pummeling the tightly covered openings. By now, the sea and their current heading made it too dangerous to send anyone out to inspect them. Any breach could prove deadly, and it was critical to protect the hatches as much as possible and detect any damage as quickly as they could. The Arlington was an old and simple ship. While she was strong and dependable, her rudimentary design made her vulnerable. It wouldn't take much to send her to the bottom of Lake Superior. With this in mind, Maxie felt that it was critical to inspect her hatches. He ordered a change in the ship's course to offer protection so Second Mate Ferris could go out and ensure their security. But as they heaved and rolled, Captain Burke stormed into the pilot house and angrily ordered them to resume their original course. Then, just as abruptly, he returned to his cabin, mumbling on his way out that they would never get any place going in the wrong direction. His crew reluctantly complied, steering back into the storm before any inspection could be made. As the early morning hours passed, wave after wave smashed over her deck, some reaching as high as 10 feet over her midships. By 3:30, Maxie was sure that the hatch covers had sustained critical damage. Brief moments that the water cleared away, he could see several places where tarpaulins had been torn and strongbacks were bent or missing. The ship was taking on water, and Maxie knew that they were about to cross the point of no return. He called down to Captain Burke's cabin to summon him to the pilot house. In these conditions, it was insane that the ship's master wasn't in command. With no reply, Maxie went down himself and banged on the captain's door. He needed him to take command so that he could organize a crew to repair the damaged hatches. He heard the man grumble and stir, but received no clear reply. Frustrated, Maxie returned to the pilot house. By now, the number 5 hatch was almost completely uncovered, and the ship had developed a 5-degree list to port. Soon, Captain Burke lurched once again into the pilot house. Maxie told him that the ship was going down. Burke barely acknowledged the dire warning, but he ordered the ship turned toward the north shore. The order came far too late to save the Arlington. Sometime just before 4:30 a.m., Chief Engineer Fred Gilbert was awoken by Second Engineer Lester Wood, who was on duty at the time. Gilbert immediately realized that the ship was listing. Wood gave him an alarming update. Water was flooding into the ship's holds. Cracking sounds suggested that the ship's wheat cargo had gotten wet and was expanding, putting even more pressure on the ship's bulkheads, and rivets were popping nearly everywhere. Gilbert raced to assess the situation himself. He found the ship's ash pits filling with water, and the bulkheads that separated the fire hole from the number 2 cargo hold was bulging and clearly near failure. The experienced engineer knew what this all meant. The ship was dying, and there was nothing they could do at this point to save her. Gilbert sprang into action. He told Woods what was happening and then raced topside, where he grabbed the ship's whistle cord and let out 5 short blasts to alert the crew. He then returned below to make sure all his men made it topside. Even before the warning, most of the Arlington's crew knew that they were in danger. Men raced down to the crew quarters to rouse anyone still sleeping, as Gilbert led the engine crews to the lifeboats. By now the list had increased, rendering one of the 2 lifeboats useless. Gilbert ordered the second lifeboat prepared. Meanwhile, in the pilot house, Captain Burke barely responded to the unfolding catastrophe. Maxie took matters into his own hands. He ran to the ship's horn and let off a distress signal. 7 short blasts, followed by 4 long ones. As he and the other men raced aft, the ship's wireless operator, William Lee, asked Captain Burke if he should send a distress signal, but the captain simply nodded to the pilot house windows. Lee looked up to see the lights of the Collingwood, only around 250 yards away. By then it was obvious to Captain Carson that the Arlington was in distress. They were close enough to see the increasingly obvious list and hear the 2 separate distress calls. He sailed as close as he could and readied his men to rescue the crew of the foundering ship. Wheelsman Elmer Callum was the last to leave the pilot house. Loyal to his post, he had remained at the ship's wheel as long as he could. But when it was painfully clear that the Arlington was all but gone, he finally abandoned his post. As he left the pilot house, he turned to Captain Burke, expecting him to join him. But Tadybug Burke stood silent. Callum raced aft to join the rest of the crew in abandoning the ship. He told them the captain wasn't coming, and with that, the crew of the Arlington set away in the lifeboat and watched quietly as their ship settled into the water before rolling over onto her port side and slipping beneath the waves. It's said that Captain Burke remained in the pilot house. He sadly waved goodbye to his crew as his ship plunged to the depths of Lake Superior. The Collingwood's logbook recorded that the Arlington went down at 5:15 a.m. on May 1st, 1940. Her crew was picked up 15 minutes later. With all but Captain Burke accounted for, Captain Carson sailed for the Sioux Locks. His ship lacked wireless equipment, so it wasn't until they arrived at the locks that word of the tragedy reached the outside world. When they arrived in the Arlington's home port of Midland, Ontario, they were greeted by a crowd of around 700 friends, family members, and onlookers. While there was great relief that the Arlington's crew made it home safely, no one could explain Captain Burke's actions that night. Investigators found no reason to believe that there were any faults with the Arlington that left her crew especially vulnerable. It was found that her owners, Captain Burke's brothers, had invested considerably to improve the ship while she was under their ownership. Likewise, the inquiry found little reason to doubt Captain Burke's abilities leading up to that fateful voyage. It was clear that the Arlington should have followed a course along the protected North Shore, or found a place to wait out the storm safely. Taking her into the middle of the lake during such conditions was a death sentence. While officials took care not to come down too harshly on the deceased captain, it was clear that it was his actions alone, or lack of action, that ultimately doomed the Arlington. No one could quite explain his strange behavior leading up to the tragedy, or his refusal to leave his ship, even when it was clear that it was doomed. Some speculated that Captain Burke was following the age-old tradition of the captain going down with his ship, but most felt that this was a silly idea. No captain on the Great Lakes had voluntarily gone down with his ship since Captain William Morris of the William F. Sauber in 1903. Further contradicting this theory was Captain Burke's own actions 16 years prior when another ship under his command, the Glenorchy, collided with another freighter in thick fog and sank in under 6 minutes. Throughout that previous incident, Captain Burke acted heroically, even risking his own life to save a wheelsman trapped in his berth by the collision. A subsequent inquiry found that Burke was not at fault for the accident or another incident early in his career when a fire took down Tadybug Burke that night. The investigation found that on May 1st, 1940, Chief Engineer Gilbert, Second Engineer Woods, and First Mate Maxey, as well as the crew of the Collingwood, all acted heroically. As for Captain Burke, his actions that night remain a mystery, and the Arlington quickly faded from memory, becoming just another ship lost to the gales of Lake Superior. But then in 2023, a Negaunee, Michigan resident reported a potential target near Copper Harbor on Lake Superior to the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society. The target led the organization to discover the wreck of the Arlington around 35 miles north of Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula. The discovery, announced only a few days ago, offers an incredible look at the over 110-year-old vessel, frozen in time in the depths of Lake Superior, right where her master guided her. But his state of mind that night will forever remain a mystery. Thank you so much for watching. I'd like to give a special shout out to my supporters on Patreon and channel members who got to see this video early and ad-free. Alright crew, that's all I've got. Till the next one, be nice to people.